There are lives that fall, and the world pretends not to hear. In a place where the map fades into a cold, empty scar, where the wind doesn't blow, it shrieks through the cracks like the cries of forsaken souls, where the earth gapes open like invisible traps, waiting to swallow any soul that dares to stray. A small life slipped into darkness. No one knew. No one stopped. No one waited. Only freezing water tearing at raw flesh. Only ragged breaths wrestling against the dark. Only a fragile heartbeat screaming against being forgotten. A young wild Mustang. Nameless. Without a savior. Without a way home. And when even the instinct to survive began to surrender. When wild life started to dim before the abyss, a figure appeared. Not a hero. Not the chosen. Just a soul long dead, choosing, for the first time, not to look away. In a moment where life was measured by drops of freezing water, a wild creature and a man hollowed out by loss chose to reach for each other. And from that place, the furthest edge of all things, a silent vow was born. If the whole world turns away, I will choose to stay. Not to be a hero, not to be a savior, but simply to hold on to one life, even if only with his last breath. And now, if you are ready to step into a journey where life and death are measured by the beat of a heart, come with me. Where the journey began was the same place the world chose to forget. Not every scream in this world is heard, and not every lost soul finds its way back. Far beyond where maps show only a blank, empty scar, there lies a place abandoned by both men and gods, the Badlands. A land where the wind doesn't just blow, it screams, it howls, like the morning breath of ghosts who lost their way and never returned. The ground is split open in jagged wounds, exhaling heat as if straight from the mouth of hell. The grass, brittle and scorched, clings stubbornly to the cracked stones. The sky is no serene blue, it's a cold, metallic sheet, hanging low and menacing over everything foolish enough to cross this wasteland. And here, in the choking silence, a herd of wild Mustangs cuts through the gale like falling stars. 15 of them. Thin, ragged, eyes bloodshot from thirst. Leading them, a young colt, barely 3 winters old, Ashen. Ashen was not the leader because of strength. Not because of age. But because of defiance. A defiance etched into his soul like a scar, one that drove him forward even when the whole world screamed there was only the abyss ahead. Ashen was born beneath a storm-torn sky. From the very first breath, he learned that freedom isn't given, it's seized. Seized with hooves. With breath. With every frantic heartbeat defying the weight of fate. His mother, an old mare named Lyra, once whispered to him over the ashes of a burned forest. Don't wait for someone to hold you back, Ashen. If you want to live, learn to run. If you want to be free, learn to never stop. And that's exactly how Ashen lived. Not the strongest. Not the wisest. But the one who never bowed to destiny. That's why. In the middle of this godless wasteland, when the older, stronger horses began to falter under despair, Ashen kept charging forward, dragging a battered, starving herd behind him. Not because he knew the way. Not because he was sure there was water ahead. But because he could not believe in giving up. The wind howled again, a warning cry from a forgotten world. And beneath the brittle weeds just ahead of Ashen, something waited. Not water. Not salvation. But an invisible trap. A gateway into a chasm from which no soul had ever returned. Ashen didn't know. None of them knew. And in less than a heartbeat, the story would begin. The wind shifted. A breath, cold and sharp as steel, slid across the back of Ashen's neck, making him jerk his head up. The Mustang herd behind him froze too, hooves scraping against the cracked earth, their chests heaving in tight, rapid gasps. Ashen's eyes swept the scorched horizon. Nothing. No water. No trees. Only an unnatural silence, too unnatural for a land that should have been humming with insects and whispering winds. But Ashen didn't stop. Stopping, even for a heartbeat, was inviting death closer. He lowered his head and tore into the wind, driven by pure, primal instinct. And then, one step. One hidden fissure no eye could see. Boom. The ground beneath Ashen exploded like an ancient trap set 1,000 years ago. In that instant, there was no time to think. No time to fear. The world vanished beneath his hooves. Falling. No weight. No direction. Only the roar of the wind in his ears and the sickening sensation of being swallowed by a gaping, endless mouth. Ashen kicked wildly, hooves flailing into empty air, useless. One breath. Two. Crash. His body slammed into freezing water, colder than knives stabbing through skin. Ashen sank, seized by the brutal cold. Black water clawed into his ears, his nose, his mouth. He coughed, choked, thrashed in blind panic. His hooves scraped against slick, slimy stone walls. No grip. No escape. Above, a pale sliver of light, impossibly far away. The scattered screams of the Mustang heard echoed from somewhere beyond, then fell silent. Ashen was alone. He fought his way to the surface, nostrils barely breaking free, gasping desperate, ragged breaths. His body shivered violently. His hooves clattered helplessly against the stone. He didn't know where he was. He only knew one thing. If he didn't get out, he would die. At first, Ashen fought like a wild thing. Forelegs thrashing. Hind legs kicking against the slick walls. His throat ripped open in agonized whinnies that bounced off the stone, but no answer came, only his own despair screaming back. The water soaked into his coat. His body grew heavier. Each breath dragged him deeper under. Every frantic kick drained a little more strength. Every desperate struggle dragged him closer to the edge of surrender. Ashen had never known fear like this. Never. The light above blurred. Darkness whispered. His nose slipped under the frigid surface. His eyes, wide and unfocused, stared into the black. His chest seized. His legs numbed. And for the first time, Ashen, the colt born to run, born to defy everything, thought maybe ending here wouldn't be so bad. But just as the darkness was about to claim him, a sound. Not the wind. Not an echo. Footsteps, heavy, deliberate, resonating from the distant mouth of the pit. Ashen blinked. His ears flicked up, instinct catching hold. His heart slammed against his ribs, not from terror, but because, for the first time in endless, suffocating despair, another soul was near. He lifted his head. The flickering light sliced through the dark like a blade. A figure, tall, silent, leaned over the edge, gazing down at him. No names. No promises. No words. Only two lost creatures. And a single, breathless moment where a fragile, newborn trust sparked in the depths of the abyss. Ashen floated, barely conscious, on the surface of the freezing water, his breath shattering like broken shards of glass. His legs kicked weakly, hooves knocking against the slick stone walls with hollow, lonely thuds, swallowed by the vast silence of the pit. The water rose, inch by inch, slow and merciless, like an invisible hand patiently squeezing the life from his heart. Ashen struggled to lift his head again, scraping his hooves along the stone. No grip. No escape. A faint whinny tore from his throat, sharp as a needle piercing the silence. Is anyone there? Can you hear me? Once, his voice had been strong enough to carry across the open plains. Now, it shattered and fell apart, swallowed by the cold, unfeeling walls and the churning, filthy water. No answer. Only echoes, hollow, empty reflections of his own dying hope. Above him, through the ashen gray sky, the Mustang herd had already faded into nothing but tiny, drifting specks. Ashen stared after them, eyes wide with raw terror. They were gone. No one had looked back. No one knew that one of their own was dying, only a few hundred steps away. The wind howled through the mouth of the pit, dragging dust and a cold so deep it sank straight to the bone. Ashen trembled. The body that once stood for wild, unbreakable freedom now sagged, a shivering, exhausted lump of flesh barely clinging to life. A violent shudder tore through him as the water climbed to his neck. He tried to push himself upward, but his muscles betrayed him, trembling, frozen. Hunger. Cold. Loneliness tore at his mind like claws. In that moment, buried beneath the deathly silence, Ashen felt himself unravel like a thin wisp of smoke scattered by a merciless desert wind. A memory flickered. The voice of his mother, Lyra, whispering when he was just a tiny foal. If one day you fall, fight. And if you can't win, fight for one more second. Ashen closed his eyes. One more second. One more kick. One more breath above the surface. Even if no one knew. Even if no one waited. Even if the ending had already been written. He whinnied one last, ragged cry, ripping through his throat, echoing against the stone, across dust and darkness. A cry for help. But also a declaration, I'm still here. And as his cry dissolved into the colorless sky, once again, only silence answered. Ashen sagged, his head dipping into the water, his breath a fragile thread, barely clinging to existence. He had seen the paths that led to freedom. Dreamed of cool streams running beneath green hills. Believed that if he ran fast enough, nothing, no one, could ever catch him. But in the end, even a warrior like Ashen could not outrun the abyss written into his fate. And then, just as the light above blurred into a thin, dying thread. Once again. Footsteps. Not an echo. Not sand sliding from the stones. Real footsteps. Heavy. Deliberate. Drawing closer. A shadow fell across the mouth of the pit. A faint, flickering light danced in the wind. Ashen opened his eyes, his pupils clouded with cold. He had no strength left to thrash. No voice left to call. And yet, by some impossible grace, his heart still beat. Even if just for one fragile moment. Even if only a flicker of hope remained. Ashen was still alive. If Ashen was a soul born to fight for freedom, then Micah Sloan was a dead man, still walking through the ruins of his own life. Not far away, where the dying light of sunset bled a thin wash of red across the land, a man moved, slow and hunched inside a battered, threadbare coat. Micah Sloan. A name once spoken with respect by the pioneers of the West. A name once shouted across racetracks and rodeo grounds, a symbol of strength, of defiance. Until 3 summers ago. A sharp bend on a mountain road. A scream. A car tumbling down a ravine. A family stolen in the span of a single heartbeat of fate. The morning they buried his wife and 6-year-old daughter under a freezing sky, Micah didn't cry. He didn't scream. He didn't pound his fists against the earth. He simply disappeared. Micah sold the ranch. Sold the horses. Sold even the old guitar he used to sing his daughter to sleep. Since then, he had lived like a ghost among the Badlands. A place too barren to sustain life, but perfect for burying those who had already died inside. This morning, Micah had risen like he always did, which is to say, he hadn't slept. He wandered the wastelands, following trails that only the sand and the wind still remembered. No purpose. No destination. He wasn't looking for anyone. He didn't want to be found. He simply existed. But then, cutting across a parched canyon, a sound. Faint. Small enough to make him freeze in place. Not a coyote's cry. Not the whisper of wind through stone. A whinny. Weak. Shattered. Like a candle guttering in a storm. Micah stood still. His heart, that useless thing he thought long dead, jolted in his chest. Maybe it was a hallucination. Maybe it was just the desert playing tricks. But somehow, without even thinking, his legs began moving faster, stronger, pulled toward the sound. A blur of dim light revealed what no one could have expected. An old, crumbling well, hidden beneath a scatter of brittle weeds. Micah approached the edge. Peered down. And at the bottom, where darkness wrapped everything in its merciless grip, he saw Ashen. A small, fierce creature battling death with every last trembling breath. A pair of eyes, cloudy with cold but still defiant, looked up at him. And for one raw, shattering instant, Micah saw himself. The man he had once been. The pain he had never outrun. The promise he had never fulfilled. If there's still someone left out there, I won't turn away. Micah clenched the collar of his coat. No hesitation. No audience. No need for memory. He knew one thing. If he turned his back now, he would no longer be human. Micah crouched down. The flashlight trembled slightly in his hand, casting a fragile beam into the drowning depths. I see you, kid, he rasped. I hear you. I'm here. And for the first time in 3 long, hollow years, Micah Sloan, the man everyone thought had died, stepped toward life again. Not for himself, but for another soul, still fighting, still clinging to this world with everything it had left. The Badlands at night were a cold-blooded nightmare. The wind scraped across the earth like rusted knives, slashing skin and slicing into every breath. Micah Sloan trudged forward through the barren desert, each step sinking into a fine layer of dust, soft and gray as ash. No campfire. No shelter. Only cold. Silence. And the restless ghost of memory trailing just behind him. He had grown used to the desert's silence. Used to not expecting anything. Used to hearing nothing but the dull thud of his own blood in his ears and the endless, restless wind. But tonight, from somewhere distant, too distant to be a trick of the mind, too real to be an echo, a sound. Micah froze, as if an invisible hand had seized him mid-step. At first, he forced himself to ignore it. Not his problem. No one needed him. He pulled his hat lower, burying himself deeper into his worn, frayed coat. One more step. Then another. But the sound, that weak, hoarse note, still bled through the wind. A whinny. Broken. A call, with no one to answer. Micah clenched his fists inside his pockets. His mind shouted, "Keep walking. There's nothing left for you to save. No one left who needs you." But his chest, where he thought only ashes remained, tightened. Not from fear. Not from the cold. But from something deeper, older than survival itself. An instinct that could not turn away. Slowly, almost without realizing it, Micah changed direction. He walked toward the sound, every step trampling across the ruins of the man he used to be. The closer he came, the stronger the smell of water grew, cold, stagnant, reeking of death and rot. And then he saw it. An old well. Its cracked mouth gaping open like a wound. Overgrown weeds struggled to hide it, as if trying to cover up nature's own crime. Micah dropped to his knees at the well's edge. His heart pounded, a living, urgent beat he hadn't felt in years. The flashlight in his hand shook slightly, its beam skimming the depths. And there, thrashing like a faded ghost in the black, filthy water, was a wild horse. Not a beast mindlessly raging against death. Not a creature blindly struggling. But a warrior, fighting for every broken second of existence. Ashen. Micah didn't know his name. Didn't know the story he had survived. But in that instant, when Ashen's clouded, freezing eyes still burned with the faintest flicker of defiance, Micah understood. The colt hadn't given up. And neither would he. Micah leaned closer, his voice rough and low, dropping into the abyss. I see you, kid. Hang on. I'm getting you out of this hellhole. A promise. Not made for anyone to hear. Not even knowing if he could keep it. The first promise he had made. Since the day he lost everything. Micah tore off his backpack. Yanked out a coil of rope. His eyes scanned the area, searching for anything he could use. No time to be afraid. No time to hesitate. Ashen was sinking. Every second counted. If he hesitated, this pit would become the grave of a soul the world would never even know existed. Micah gritted his teeth. Tightened the rope around his waist. He knew one truth. If you jump down there, Micah, no one's coming to pull you out. But for the first time in 3 years, death wasn't the thing he feared most. It was standing by and doing nothing. Watching another life slip away because he didn't move. The wind howled through the cracked well. The water slapped against the stone. Ashen's body sank deeper, his head tipping to the side, barely holding on. Micah inhaled sharply. Secured the rope tighter. And without hesitation, he jumped. The water slammed into him like a punch of pure ice. Micah Sloan plunged into the old well, his body yanked downward as if stones were tied to him. The rope looped loosely around his waist, unraveled and jerked wildly in the dark water. No light. No air. Only the pounding of water and the deafening roar of his own heart in his ears. He kicked hard, forcing himself upward. The shoulder-mounted flashlight flickered, casting a shaky, dying beam across stone walls, slimy moss, and there. Him. Ashen. A drenched, mud-caked figure, floating barely conscious in the death-cold water. His head sagged forward. His nose dipped beneath the surface. His ears drooped, trembling. Micah lunged like a drowning man. He seized Ashen's mane, yanking his head above water. No, no, no! Micah roared, his voice raw and breaking. Water poured into his mouth. He clamped down harder. His breaths came in shattered gasps. Ashen lifted his eyes. Those deep brown eyes, clouded by cold and exhaustion, locked onto Micah's. And in that instant, there were no man and horse. No boundaries. Only two lost souls, forgotten by the world. Reaching for each other. Micah saw something in those eyes he thought had long been dead. A spirit that had not surrendered. Ashen, though water had risen to his throat, though his body sagged like a crumbling leaf, had not given up. And in Micah's gaze, Ashen saw something too. Not the eyes of a predator. Not the pitying gaze of a bystander. But the eyes of someone who knew exactly what it meant to shatter and still stand up. Micah gritted through his teeth. You're not dying today, kid. He pulled a second rope from his belt. His hands shook from the cold, but his mind was sharper than it had been in years. He looped the rope under Ashen's chest. Each passed through the colt's soaked, shivering coat, making Ashen flinch and tremble in the freezing water. I know, it hurts. It's cold. But hold on just a little longer. The water surged higher. The stone walls began to weep torrents. The old well was collapsing. They were running out of time. Micah tightened the knot. He looked up and shouted toward the well's edge. Pull! Pull now! A shout answered back, and the rope jerked taut. Micah wrapped himself around Ashen. Not just to keep the colt from slipping back down, but as if he were clinging to the last scrap of himself still worth saving. Ashen shivered. His body, scraped raw against the stone, blood mixing with the dirty water, kicked weakly. But as the rope strained, as his body slowly lifted from the black water, Ashen did not thrash, did not panic like a wild thing. He chose, in that final hour, to trust the hands pulling him out of hell. Inch by inch, Ashen's soaked, battered frame rose from the surface. Every centimeter upward was a war against gravity, against the cold, against the silent hands of death still tugging from below. Micah clung to the rope, frozen to the core, eyes never leaving Ashen. If the rope snapped, if the well walls collapsed, if the hands above slipped, it would all end here. Pebbles broke loose from the walls. Water poured in from every crack. The entire pit shook. Micah bared his teeth against the cold and the fear. Come on, Ashen. Come on, kid. A brutal jerk. The rope swung wildly. Water exploded upward. And then, light. Hands gripped the rope. Shouts. The shriek of metal straining under weight. Ashen gasped, his hooves scraping against the muddy ledge above. Micah surfaced right after, his body battered, torn, spent. They collapsed onto the ground, lungs tearing at the air, each breath a broken, ragged victory. Both alive, but no longer the same. The darkness at the bottom of that well had buried a lone, broken Ashen. And when he was pulled back into the light, for the first time in his life, Ashen was no longer alone. The wind howled through the mouth of the well, like the wailing of souls trapped and forgotten. The freezing water continued to rise, inch by inch, relentless. Micah clenched his teeth. His hands worked furiously, wrapping an old rope he'd yanked from his backpack, a rope once used to tie down supplies during his long, aimless wanderings across the Badlands. It wasn't made for this. It was frayed, weathered by frost and time. But there was no other choice. Ashen sagged in his arms, his body half sunken in the freezing, filthy water. The colt's eyes fluttered weakly, the last flicker of light before darkness could claim him. Micah tightened the rope around Ashen's chest. The knot dug into the soaked, shivering fur. Hold on, kid, Micah whispered, voice trembling from cold and fear. A signal. A hoarse shout. Above, the rescue team began to pull. The rope stretched taut, screaming under the weight of a life dangling at the edge of death. Micah clung to Ashen, his eyes locked onto every agonizing inch they gained. Every foot. Every second. Every stolen breath fought with raw, clawing desperation. Snap. A tiny sound, like a bone breaking. Micah froze. He looked down at his hands. The rope. Fraying. Splitting, strand by strand. Pull faster. Micah roared, voice shredding in the cold air. The rescue team above scrambled. The pulley screamed, metal shrieking under the strain. Ashen, exhausted beyond endurance, twitched slightly, as if he, too, understood that one wrong move could end it all. Snap. Again. The rope writhed in Micah's hands, groaning like a dying creature. Every muscle in Micah's body spasmed with rage and terror. He screamed again, gripping Ashen tighter. Not enough. Not fast enough. Crack. The rope tore apart. The sound, like thunder splitting the soul of the earth, echoed through the well. For a heartbeat, time slowed to nothing. Ashen plummeted. His body smashed into the freezing water below. An impact sharp and brutal as a breaking heart. Micah nearly lost his grip, the ground vanishing beneath him, the world tipping sideways. Water exploded upward. Ashen vanished beneath the surface for a breathless second. Micah bared his teeth, lunged forward, seizing Ashen again, dragging the colt's head above water with everything he had left inside him. No! No, he bellowed, pure anguish ripping from his throat. Ashen coughed and gasped, his body shivering violently like a battered leaf in a hurricane. His eyes, clouded, desperate, met Micah's. And even though he was broken, his breath shattered. Ashen was still alive. Micah growled through clenched teeth, chest heaving. I swear, I'm not letting you die here. Even if it breaks my back. Even if it rips me apart. I'm getting you out of this goddamn hole. A raw, hoarse roar tore from his lungs. The roar of a man who had lost everything and refused to lose one more soul. The wind shrieked above. The water slammed against the walls. The darkness closed in around them. But in the collapsing, crumbling pit, a man and a dying colt clung to each other and refused to let go. Micah gripped the frayed rope, but when it snapped, he didn't hesitate. Not for a second. Not for a shout. Not for a second thought. He dove. The water hit him like 1,000 knives, slicing straight through skin and bone. The darkness wrapped around him, thick, heavy, suffocating, trying to drag him under forever. Micah plunged deeper, searching blindly through the mud-thick blackness until his hand collided with a trembling, sodden form. Ashen. A waterlogged Ashen. An Ashen whose heartbeat was slipping away. Micah locked his arm around the colt's chest and heaved upward. You're not leaving, you hear me? He growled, voice shredded by cold and rage. They surfaced. The freezing water battered them with relentless, merciless blows. Micah clutched Ashen tight, keeping the colt's head above the surface, gasping for breath in the blackness. 2 lives. 1 shattered well. 1 flood of ice-cold death pressing in on every last breath they had left. And no one would get to them in time if they didn't hold on themselves. Micah pressed his face close to Ashen's ear, roaring over the crashing water. You hear me, kid? I'm right here. Hold on. Ashen, frail as a crumpled leaf, shivered in his arms. No strength to fight. No strength to resist. Only a single, fragile thread of trust, thinner than a hair, binding him to that desperate embrace. Darkness closed in. The water climbed higher, seeping cold into every cell. But they, a man and a wild, battered soul, did not let go. The rumble of engines tore through the silence. A small earthquake rolling across a dying world. Rescue teams. Headlights sliced through the night like flaming spears. Micah raised his head, blinking against the salt and grit burning his eyes. Here. Over here, he bellowed, throat raw and bleeding. A rescue hoist, heavy and battered, whirred as the winch spun above. The rescuers rushed. Their faces, illuminated by the headlights, were pale and strained with fear. But the ground began to shudder. A low tremor, building, deepening. Micah knew instantly. The well was collapsing. Cracks snaked along the stone walls like hungry, slithering monsters. Time wasn't measured in minutes anymore. It was down to seconds. Micah lunged, seized the hoist cable. His hands shook from cold and exhaustion. He looped the line around Ashen, tying it as fast as his frozen fingers allowed. "Hold on, kid. I'm getting you out." A hand signal. The hoist engine screamed. The cable stretched. Ashen lifted from the water, limp and slick as a figure molded from mud. Micah pushed hard from underneath. Inch by brutal inch. "Go," he roared, voice ragged and wild. Every inch. Every second. Ashen rose higher. 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 Crack. A sound like the world tearing apart. The stone wall fractured. Water and debris exploded upward. A massive section of rock sheared off, missing Micah by barely an arm's length. The well was going. Ashen reached the lip just in time. Dozens of hands lunged, seized him, hauled him out. Micah looked up. A cracked, broken smile stretched across his bloodied lips. Ashen was alive. But the well wasn't going to wait for him. Micah gripped the rope, hauling himself upward, inch by punishing inch. As the ground collapsed below him, the rescue team threw down another line. He climbed blindly, blood trickling from torn knees and shredded elbows. And just as Micah's hand caught the outstretched grip of a rescuer, boom! A massive section of the well's wall caved in. Mud and rock exploded in a brutal shockwave. The blast smashed Micah into the jagged stone. He heard, felt, the crack of ribs snapping inside him. Blinding pain. But he did not let go. The rescuers screamed. They pulled with everything they had. Micah tumbled onto the ground, coughing and gasping, his fingers still locked around the fraying rope like a man clinging to life itself. And when he lifted his head, Ashen was standing there, only a few paces away. The colt, battered, trembling, bleeding from ragged wounds, stood like a shredded flag in the storm, breathless, broken. But Ashen hadn't run. He hadn't panicked. He hadn't turned away. He stood there, staring straight into Micah's eyes. Those dark brown eyes. Heavy, deep, full of something far greater than words. Locked onto the gaze of the man who had fought death to reach him. And in the silver wash of dawn, amid the ruins and rubble of a night spent in hell, a silent vow was carved into both their hearts. We survived. Not because we were lucky, but because we refused to let go. Ashen staggered across the cold ground, each step heavy as stone. Micah walked beside him. Not touching. Not pulling. Not forcing. Just accompanying. They brought Ashen to a temporary rescue camp hastily set up in the heart of the prairie. No cages. Only a low wooden fence, enough to shelter, not to imprison. But the moment Ashen was released inside the enclosure, he whirled around, eyes blazing with undiminished wildness. Micah stood still. He knew. One wrong move, a loud noise, a wrong glance, a gesture that pushed too hard, and Ashen would panic, would strike, would destroy himself trying to flee. Not just from this place, but from Micah himself. Micah stepped back. He removed his hat, lowered his head. No orders, no claiming, no threat, only a silent message. I'm not here to trap you. I'm just here. The wind swept across the camp. Ashen exhaled sharply, puffs of white mist coiling in the cold air. The space between them, only a few meters wide, was a canyon of trust. A canyon no whip, no rope could cross. Only patience. The first day, Micah sat 10 paces away. Not staring. Not inching closer. Just existing, like a harmless rock in the desert. The second day, 8 paces. The third day, 7. No words. No bribes. No commands. Only silence. Steadfast as a boulder weathering a sandstorm. There were times Ashen reared up. Times he stamped the ground, snorted clouds of steam like a defiant warrior warning intruders. Micah stayed put. Waiting. Like a gatekeeper. Neither pushing nor pulling. Only keeping the door open. For when Ashen was ready to walk through. On the fourth night, sitting quietly by the worn wooden fence, Micah closed his eyes. A memory surfaced. A black horse named Shatter. The most beloved animal he had ever known. Long ago, he had tried to force Shatter's trust. Forced it with reins. Forced it with fences. Forced it with fear. And Shatter had run. One night, in a blinding sandstorm, Shatter had bolted into the canyon and never returned. All because Micah hadn't understood. Trust cannot be forced with rope. Micah opened his eyes, looked at Ashen, and vowed silently, "This time, I won't destroy another soul." On the fifth morning, as the sun rose like a burning copper coin at the edge of the world, Ashen approached the fence. He stopped. His gaze met Micah's, wary, sharp. Micah didn't move. He breathed. Slow and steady. Letting his presence become just another part of Ashen's fragile, precarious world. One breath. 2. Ashen took a step forward. A small step. But it cracked the earth open like a silent earthquake. And then, touch. A brush so light it was barely more than a breath of air. The tip of Ashen's muzzle grazed the fabric of Micah's worn jacket. No whinny. No pounding hooves. Just a single, trembling touch. And the world itself seemed to hold its breath. Micah didn't turn. Didn't reach out. He only whispered, "I knew you'd come, kid. When you were ready." In that moment, under a sky spun gold like newborn honey, between a man broken by loss and a wild soul nearly buried by darkness, an invisible bridge was built. On the sixth night, the camp was silent. Only the sound of the wind brushing through the dry grass, whispering stories no one else could understand. Micah sat against the fence post, a thin blanket draped over his shoulders. Ashen stood a few paces away. Unbound. Unchained. He could leave any time. But he chose to stay. Micah told no stories with words. He spoke through presence. Through slow, steady breaths. Through shared silences charged with meaning. Through slight nods whenever Ashen snorted. Through glances that never demanded, only acknowledged. The wind carried away the words. Carried away the fear. Only silent understanding remained. A man broken, but not beaten. A wild spirit, finding, perhaps for the first time, a place he didn't need to run from. Beneath a night sky dusted with silver stars, an old lesson rose in their hearts. Trust isn't about conquering. It's an invitation. It's patience. It's the wind. It's freedom. It's being present without chaining anything. And never disappearing. The rescue camp stood silent under the soft glow of a rose-tinted dawn. Micah Sloan stood before the weathered wooden gate. His hand rested on the latch. A simple gesture, but it carried the weight of 1,000 silent promises. He gave a gentle push. The gate swung open. No creak. No chains. No commands. Micah turned his back, walked a few paces away, and sat down. He didn't look at Ashen. Didn't call him. Didn't beg. Freedom, Micah murmured to himself, is not about being held back. Freedom is about choosing. Ashen stood at the open gate, the wind teasing through his mane like invisible fingers beckoning him forward. Ahead lay the Badlands. Vast. Wild. Unclaimed. Behind him stood Micah. Silent. Steadfast. Unbinding. The gate was open. The road was clear. All that remained was the choice. And the heart to make it. Ashen lifted his head. Once. Then lowered it again, staring at the open space between him and the wild. He took one step. Beyond the fence. A strong gust swept through, carrying the scent of dry grass and sun-baked earth. The familiar, feral smell of the world he had been born to. Instinct flared. Instinct screamed. Run. Vanish into the wind. Don't trust the hands of men. Ashen hesitated. His whole body tensed, drawn taut like a bowstring. One side offered total freedom. The other, an unspoken promise. A silent gaze that waited without binding, without demanding. 1 second. 2. Ashen turned his head. He didn't bolt. He didn't vanish into the prairie. He didn't disappear. He stepped toward Micah. Each stride carried the weight of every fear, every wound, every shattered instinct. And, finally, the hope he had never dared believe in. Micah lowered his head, blinking back the sting in his eyes. Not because he had won. Not because he had conquered. But because a miracle had just taken place. A wild soul had chosen trust, with no leash but its own heart. Micah rose quietly to his feet. He pulled from his coat a rope. New, soft, untouched by fear. And set it gently on the fence. No reaching out. No stepping forward. Just offering. Ashen looked at the rope. This time, he didn't shy away. No snorting. No backing off. With a motion slow and natural as breathing, Ashen stepped forward, lowered his head, and allowed Micah to slip the rope over his neck. No fear. No resistance. Bathed in the golden light of morning, Micah whispered, "I'm not tying you down. I'm just walking with you." The early wind howled across the wild land. Dust rose in choking clouds. The sun blazed fierce, raw, like the world's first fire. Micah stood beside Ashen, the rope loose in his hand, his heart pounding heavy and slow. Before him, Ashen raised his head, eyes blazing, catching the sunrise like a living torch. Micah breathed slowly. "Not because I force you. Not because I beg. Only if you want to, kid." Ashen moved forward. Steadily, without hesitation. No command. No pressure. He stopped in front of Micah. Close enough that Micah could hear the broken, stubborn thunder of the colt's lungs fighting for every breath. Micah bent slightly. No bridle. No saddle. Just his hand resting gently against Ashen's mane, light as a prayer. Ashen didn't flinch. Didn't falter. He lowered his head and allowed Micah to climb onto his back. As soon as Micah settled, Ashen didn't wait for a signal. He surged forward. A blast of raw power erupted beneath Micah's legs. The earth roared. They thundered into the open prairie. The wind screaming past their ears like the jubilant cries of all the wild souls who had ever lived. No reins. No whips. Only trust. Only a vow unspoken. If you fall, I fall. If you fly, I fly with you. They didn't ride. They flew. Flew through the fiery dawn. Flew away from loss, from despair, from everything that had once broken them. Flew into a world made only of freedom, trust, and courage. That afternoon, as the sun poured fire onto the earth, smoke rose in thin threads along the ridge. At first, barely a whisper. Then, the wind shifted. The fire swept down like a flood of red terror. Micah yanked the rope. "Let's go, kid. We have to move." Ashen whinnied, rearing, then launched into a wild sprint through grass already igniting at their feet. Trees snapped and crashed in burning cascades. Ash clouds filled the sky. Heat rolled off the ground like a living thing, a storm from hell itself. Suddenly, a massive, blackened tree, charred to its core, cracked and toppled from the ridge above. Straight toward them. Micah heard the snap. He turned. Too late. The tree fell like a divine hammer crashing toward earth. No escape. In a heartbeat quicker than thought, Ashen screamed. A cry that tore through the heavens. He twisted, drove himself forward. A brutal shove. Micah was hurled sideways. Thrown clear so violently he thought his ribs would shatter. And the next instant, crash. The tree slammed into the ground where he had just been. A small earthquake of impact. Ash clouds engulfed them. Micah rolled, coughing, clawing for Ashen. Kid. Ashen. Through the choking darkness, Ashen stood. Legs scraped and bleeding. Coat scorched. Body shivering with shock and heat. But standing. Not fleeing. Not collapsing. Ashen had saved him. Micah broke down. No sobs. No tears. Just a body convulsing under the unbearable weight of something too large for words. Ashen stepped forward. His eyes, wild, defiant, but burning now with something greater than instinct. Loyalty. A wild soul had chosen to protect him. Not out of fear. Not for reward. But for love beyond species, beyond language, beyond everything. The next morning, the desert shimmered under a heavy veil of dew. The sunrise splintered into 1,000 mirrored shards. Micah sat atop Ashen. The rope slack in his hand. His heart full of a peace he had never known before. They didn't need saddles. They didn't need reins. They only needed each other. A man who had lost everything. A wild soul who had almost drowned in darkness. Now, they galloped side by side, like two branches of the same eternal river. Ashen broke into a full gallop. Dust exploded behind his hooves. The wind tore across Micah's face, dragging from him a laugh. Pure, wild. The laugh of a boy too long buried. No past. No fear. Only now. Micah bowed his head into the wind and whispered, "Freedom isn't leaving someone behind. Freedom is choosing to stay. With all your heart." Ashen reared high, whinnying into the bright, bursting sky. And together, they raced toward the blazing horizon. And somewhere in that rising light, a human soul and a wild soul found each other at last. No ownership. No chains. Only the absolute, breathtaking freedom. To stay. Because they chose to. To love. Because they dared. It wasn't because Ashen was weak that he needed saving. And it wasn't because Micah was strong that he stayed. It was because they found each other on the razor-thin edge between life and oblivion. Through the only thing that can't be bought, can't be demanded, voluntary trust. Sometimes, saving another soul is how we save the piece of ourselves that almost disappeared. We were not born to face this world alone. Not because we are weak, but because sometimes we need a gaze, a breath, a heartbeat beside us to remind us we are still worth fighting for. True freedom isn't about walking away. It's about choosing to stay with all your heart, even when no one forces you to. Micah didn't hold Ashen back with a rope. Ashen didn't stay because he was chained. They chose to stay in a world that's always ready to abandon the fragile. And if you're hearing this story now, if you've ever felt lost in the desert of life, if you've ever come close to letting go, remember, sometimes it only takes holding on for one more breath. And someone, somewhere, is crossing an entire wasteland just to find you. The story ends here, but the journey of choosing has only just begun. If you believe that every life deserves another chance, join us. Share this story. Subscribe to Gallop of Glory. And help us keep writing journeys where trust never dies.